There is a lot to like about this lens. Firstly, it's very, very sharp. It might just be the sharpest lens I've ever used. Well, hey everybody, thank you for once again checking in. Well, it's a beautiful autumn day here in London in the UK, and I think it's going to be one of the last nice sunny days before all the mush and slush and rain comes down upon us. Anyway, what are we doing today? Well, okay, today we're going to look at a vintage lens with a difference in that it's not a vintage lens at all. It's a modern lens. It's this one, the Fujifilm XC 15 to 45, and this is a beautiful little lens. I don't know if you can see it there. It's a very beautiful little lens. We'll have a close-up look in a little while. But this was the lens shipped with the Fujifilm XA cameras, and I believe the XT100 and possibly 200 cameras. It's a sort of little sibling to the XF 18 to 55, and its 15 to 45 range gives it an equivalent of around about 23 to 70, so it goes pretty wide. It goes a lot wider than many of the kit zooms that you might find. This lens came to me on my Fujifilm X-T1, which I sadly don't have anymore. I sold that camera on and I've occasionally regretted it, but that's how I got hold of this lens. I've not really used it a lot, but I was playing around with it recently. I took it out for a shoot and I was very impressed by how it did. I was very impressed by its optical qualities and the images it made, and it's actually a really nice little lens if, like all lenses, you work within what it can do and don't try to ask of it what it can't do. Having said that, it can cope with most photographic situations. It's got a really nice range, it's very easy to use, it's small and light and portable. It's a kind of a take anywhere lens. So without further yakking from me, let's go over to our studio reporter, Hetherington Barrington automatic transmission the 4th, and see what he makes of this lens in close-up. So here's the lens in close-up, and it sits very nicely on the camera. It doesn't look too large and it's certainly not too heavy. It hardly adds any weight at all. It's an all plastic lens. It's none the worse for that, and that contributes to its lightness, makes it a very light, very portable, take anywhere, go anywhere sort of lens. It has two control rings. The first one at the front there is the focus ring. That moves very nicely and easily, and it's very easy just to move that with your finger if you want to focus manually. However, there's not quite as much weight as I would have liked. It moves very, very easily, and I think I would have preferred a little more weight to a focus ring than that, but it does work nicely. That said, behind it is the zoom ring. That's not a ring that turns all the way. It's got a center point and it's spring loaded, so you can turn it to the right and zoom, or to the left and retract the zoom. When you turn the camera on, the lens does extend a little, so that's how it's going to be in use. So it's a little longer than it first seems, and it doesn't really move much throughout the zoom range. If we take it right through the range, it'll just come back a little way. At the wide end, it's actually a little longer than when it's fully zoomed in, where it's slightly shorter, but it is just a slightly bigger lens in use than it might first appear. Let's take it off the camera so we can see it a bit more clearly. So there's the lens, and there's the rear, and even at the back this lens has a plastic mount So it's a very, very light thing indeed. Optically, this is a really nice lens. It has 10 elements, and I believe it has 2 aspherical elements. This is an aspherical lens, and it's proudly stated on the front there. So it's got some very, very nice glass in this very lightweight, take anywhere little plastic body. A very nice little lens indeed. There is a lot to like about this lens. Firstly, it's very, very sharp. It might just be the sharpest lens I've ever used, and I really can't offhand think of another lens that gives quite as crisp and sharp images as these are. They really are stunningly sharp. Every little bit of detail is rendered very, very clearly, certainly in the subject, often in the background as well, depending on your aperture setting. So this really is a lens that gives a tremendous amount of detail. There's not really any need to turn up the sharpening or the detail on the camera, because this lens makes sure every shot is very, very sharp indeed. Really quite something. If you like a nice sharp shot, this lens is well worth considering. It really is quite something, the level of detail that comes out of this unassuming and humble little piece of glass. It's got really strong colour and contrast as well. This is a very, very contrasty lens. I've not shot that many modern lenses, maybe 7 or 8 or so. This is the most contrasty one out of those that I've shot, and I really can't think of another one that would beat it as far as contrast and resistance to flaring go also, because that's an important part of a lens's contrast performance. If a lens can't maintain its contrast in varying light conditions and maybe needs a hood, then that's one thing. But a lens that resists flaring as this one does and maintains its contrast, that's another thing. And this is a very, very contrasty lens indeed. Blacks are really black, lighter shades and whites are really light, and there's a tremendous range of contrast in between those points. This is a very, very contrasty lens indeed. Possibly the most contrasty one I've ever shot, so it's doing pretty well so far. It does go quite a bit wider than a lot of kit zooms. Many kit zooms are an equivalent 28 to 70 focal length on full frame. This one is approximately 23 to 70, so you get a wider zoom than you get on most kit zooms, and it really does give you a very wide shot indeed, quite a panorama actually, and you get a real feeling of space, a real sense of a good open wide shot that can really open up the area to photograph. And it really is quite something to have a zoom this wide. It's very unusual in a kit zoom, and I'm quite glad of it actually. I've used it on a few occasions just to see that panorama, just to get that panoramic, wide, great big open feel that you don't get with too many kit zooms. And this one can certainly do it. It really opens up the shot, giving you a big, wide, fresh, panoramic shot full of air and light and space. So that's a real nice quality of this lens. It will make some blur, because all lenses do, but this is not a blur monster. It's not going to make you a tremendous amount of blur. It's an APS-C lens and it's an f3.5 to f5.6. So if you want to make blur, you're going to need to be pretty close to your subject. If you go close to your subject, yes, it will make you some blur. Sometimes if you go to the minimum focus distance, sometimes that can be quite considerable blur. Mostly it's just a moderate sort of blur to give you some separation between the subject and the background, which it does successfully. In those situations, the blur is nice and smooth, but if you go very close to your subject, sometimes it does get a bit wild, a little bit rough, and it loses that buttery smoothness that it gives in other situations. But yeah, reasonably nice blur, but not a blur monster. And I think because it's not a blur monster, the shots it gives us have a certain feel. They feel gritty, they feel urban, they feel realistic, and it has that naturalistic feel, the feel of actually capturing the almost the underbelly of what you're looking at. A real gritty, raw sort of feel from this lens, if you want it in certain situations. It does have a really good close focus ability of around about 13 centimeters, and that is quite a lot closer than most kit zooms, at least most that I've used, go. So you really can get very close to your subject with this lens, and that's the point at which you'll start to make some blur, and it can make a nice shot with a very blurred background, very close to the subject, and give you quite a big close-up actually. I mean, it's not a macro lens by any means, but it does show you a little bit of detail. It can go closer than most kit zooms, and you can get a nice close-up with it. It's a stabilised lens as well, and I really appreciate that. That means you can get, gosh, I don't know, maybe an extra stop of light before you get camera shake. And it's also really good for video. It doesn't solve all the movement problems in video. It's not like a gimbal, but it really does help to steady the shot and get rid of micro jitters. It's great for low light still shots as well, and that's a thing that I'm very pleased was included in this lens. It would have been easy to cheap out and think, oh well, gosh, this is just the cheaper family of lenses, so we won't put stabilization on it. But I'm very glad that Fujifilm decided to do that, because it really does transform a lens and make it possible to use it in situations where you couldn't use other lenses. So I'm very pleased to see that feature in this lens. It autofocuses very, very quickly. There's practically no delay between pushing the button halfway and hearing the little beep. So very fast autofocus, that's pretty much immediate, and that's quicker than, certainly quicker than my old Sony A7, which is not very quick to autofocus. So very fast focusing speed. There's no delay between pushing that button halfway and acquiring focus, so it means that you're pretty much ready all the time to get that shot. You're not going to miss many shots because of lack of focus with this lens, because it autofocuses very, very quickly indeed, and that's a great feature. It's really resistant to flaring, and its small size and lightweight mean that this is really pretty much a go anywhere, take anywhere lens, a lens that you can use in many, many different shooting situations and circumstances, and a lens that's always at the ready, nice and small and light, no bother, no fuss, just a great take anywhere lens. So things that I'm less keen on about this lens, well, it doesn't remember its zoom settings. So if you zoom to a particular point and you take a little time to set it up and get the distance just right, if you turn off the camera, it forgets its zoom setting and it doesn't return to what you originally set it at. So if you've perhaps, say, set it to the long end, and you turn off your camera and turn it on again, it will begin always at the short end. It doesn't remember the previous zoom setting, and I do find that a little awkward and irksome, especially if I'm filming with it. I've set up the shot just nicely, just as I want it, and I'll turn it off and on again and the whole thing's gone, and you've got to try and find it again by comparing to the previous shot, and that's a really difficult thing to do, and it does mess up a shoot if you're not careful. It has an electronic zoom ring and also electronic focus rings, as I've mentioned, but that electronic zoom ring is not as precise as a manual zoom ring would be, in that if you want very fine adjustment, then you can't really do that. It's, you know, you've got to try and just nudge it just to the point you want it, and it is quite tricky. So I would prefer a mechanical zoom ring because the electronic one isn't entirely as precise. It's not far off, it's almost the same, and it's certainly similar, but it doesn't have that degree of precision that a mechanical zoom would have. There's not a lot of blur possible from this lens. It really isn't a natural blur monster, and while you can get blur out of it, you need to really go to the long end and stay very close to your subject before you'll get any significant blur. So as, for example, a portrait lens, using as a portrait lens, I don't think it would do terribly well because there's not a lot of blur you can make. You need to be very close to the subject, and this is a very sharp lens as well. Portraits are often better shot a little soft, so I don't think it's ideal for portraits because of that. I think it's more suited to shooting on the street. I think that's its natural habitat and it's really successful there. Or possibly landscapes. If you're interested in landscape photography, it would do really well for that as well because it's very, very sharp and it goes pretty wide. Sadly, there aren't any markings on this lens. I would have liked some distance markings, maybe a depth of field scale. There's a manual focus ring after all, so manual focus is possible. So a depth of field scale and some distance markings would be nice. There's also no aperture ring on this lens, and I do find that a little tricky. You can control it electronically. I've got my camera configured so it's worked by this little wheel here just above my thumb, if you can see that. But I would much rather have an aperture ring on the lens. You don't always want to be controlling it with dials and you know, electronic controls, so it would be nice to have that there. However, it's not. I guess you can't have everything. So in summary then, this is a really great take anywhere, go anywhere, always at the ready, chuck it in your bag sort of lens that will cover a wide range of photographic situations. It's great on the street. It focuses very, very quickly. It would be fantastic for landscape. Not so great for portraits. If you want a nice blurry background portrait, it's not really going to do that for you, but it will do everything else that I can think of. It's light, small and portable, very, very light lens, so that's another factor in its take anywhere, go anywhere sort of quality. And perhaps most importantly, this lens is now pretty cheap. When they were new, they cost around £250, and you still see new ones advertised for around that figure. But you can get a really good used example of this lens for between 100 to 120, 130 pounds, and for a great lightweight take anywhere, go anywhere sort of lens that is really, really sharp and will deliver great colour and contrast shot after shot, I think that is a bargain. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I think that's about it from me for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you also to subscribers for your support. That's really appreciated. And if you've enjoyed the show today, why not chuck us a sub? That would be appreciated too. Thank you very much to patrons without whom this show couldn't be made in the form that it is, so that's really appreciated. Many thanks to you. But as from me, I think that's about it for this week. If you'd like to support this show, you can do that over at patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. But as for now, I think that's about it. Many thanks for watching, and if you're not doing anything too difficult or irksome next week at around this time, why not join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.